tonight's program. It's designed to give you a taste of the historical depth and geographic breadth of the communities, the Jewish communities in New England. This is by no means a comprehensive look at the extremely diverse Jewish experience in our region, but we hope it will encourage you to further engage with the New England's Jewish history and the many organizations that are dedicated to preserving and telling the story of Jewish New Englanders, both past and present. Tonight, we're pleased to welcome presenters from 3 such organizations: the Touro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, Strawbery Banke Museum in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and the Vilna Shul in Boston. First speaker tonight will be Rabbi Marc Mandel at the Touro Synagogue. The Touro Synagogue is the oldest synagogue building in the United States. Rabbi Mandel has served as a rabbi in California, New York, Maine, Connecticut, and has a master's in community organization and a doctor of ministry in congregational life. Rabbi Mandel often makes appearances as a teacher and representative of the Jewish community at public and private events. And then next we will hear from Maddie Beale, who is the role-playing coordinator at Strawbery Banke Museum. Maddie is responsible for the research, training, and costuming that takes place behind the scenes of the museum's daily programs. Prior to working at Strawbery Banke, Maddie interned at the old Sturbridge Village in Sturbridge, Massachusetts, where she created new offerings for history-themed summer camps. She has served on the board of the Warner House Association, Portsmouth, and she brings to the museum extensive experience in historical research, educational programming, and museum interpretation. She earned her BA from the University of New Hampshire and is currently pursuing her master's degree in history. And finally, to give us an overview of Jewish immigration in the late 19th and early 20th century, as well as contemporary Jewish community life in Boston, will be Lynne Krasker Schultz, Director of Public Programs and Community Outreach at the Vilna Shul, Boston Center for Jewish Culture. Lynne has served as the Director of Public Programming and Community Development at the Vilna Shul since 2015. She joins the Vilna after consulting with CJP on their Families and Young Children North Shore initiative. Prior to working with the CJP, she served as Director of Development at the Stoneham Theater and was founder-director of PRISM, the young adult initiative of the New Center for Arts and Culture. She worked with the New Center for nearly 7 years on marketing, programming, and board development. She holds a BA in political science and a BS in public relations from Boston University and currently resides in the North Shore with her husband and 2 children. So I would like to welcome all our panelists, and let's get started with Rabbi, who is going to tell us about the wonderful Touro Synagogue. Rabbi Mandel, can you share your screen?
Absolutely. Yes, getting that all ready. And I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. It's a beautiful day in New England, and it's wonderful for us to be together for this fascinating and insightful topic, to talk about the history of the New England Jewish community. And thank you so much, Claire, for all your coordination of this program. Thank you to Historic New England for creating this program and for inviting the entire panel to give this presentation and bringing New England together, uniting all of New England so that we can all learn about each other's cultures and histories. And I guess I'm going first because Touro Synagogue, of course, has been around for quite a while, and I'm honored to be able to represent the synagogue this evening. I am the rabbi at the Touro Synagogue, as Claire had mentioned, and it's a wonderful and interesting position to be the rabbi of this historic synagogue. It's not like any other position that I ever had as a rabbi, and that's obviously because, you know, the history here is just incredible, and that's what we're going to talk about for the next few moments. As Claire mentioned, this is not a comprehensive historical description of Touro Synagogue and the Jews of Rhode Island, but it's a start, and that's always great to do. And I'm going to start with the history of the Jews in Newport before the Touro Synagogue was even thought about, and before the synagogue was anywhere on anyone's mind, in this very, very small Jewish community in Newport. Many of you have probably been to Newport. It's on the coast, and you know, part of the beautiful state of Rhode Island, about a 45-minute drive from Providence. And of course, Rhode Island is not a very large state to start with. So let's start in 1677, which is an amazing thing to think about. It's almost mind-boggling to think that there were Jewish people on these shores in 1677. You know, when we think of Jewish history, the reach of Jewish history, and we think about some of the things that were going on for Jews all over the world in 1677, and then at that very same time, to have a community here is incredible. This is a monument that you would find if you came to visit Touro Synagogue. Up the street, about 2.5 blocks, is the cemetery that was owned by the people of the Touro community. And this was purchased, the land was purchased in 1677, as you can see. That means the Jews were already here for quite a while. And we're thinking that they were here in the 1650s. You can see some of the people that were interned at the cemetery. We're going to come back to some of those names in a few moments. Take a quick look at some of those names. We're going to seeing these some of these names again. These were the people who helped build this community. So let's take a look at a document that we have here. This is from the congregation Shar Hashemayim, today known as the Bevis Mark Synagogue in London. And this is from 1754. Okay, so we jumped from 1677, when the cemetery was purchased, to 1754. So that means that it took a while, quite a while, for the small community to grow and prosper enough to start thinking about building a synagogue, which makes sense because there weren't, you know, hundreds and hundreds of Jewish people in Newport. It was a small community, and it always remained a rather small community. Let's take a look at this letter. This letter is written to the Jews of Newport. At that time, you see the congregation was called Nefutze Israel. Nefutze Israel means the scattered of Israel, because they really were a scattered people. You know, they came from many different places to Newport, not just from one particular spot. So they called themselves appropriately the scattered of Israel in the beginning stages. So in 1754, they received a letter from the congregation Shar Hashemayim, and this is again known as the Bevis Mark Synagogue today. Apparently, the congregation in Touro, in Newport, reached out for a donation. Here's the letter. Let's read it. We'll just skim it. We won't read the entire letter. It says, "We received your very esteemed letter, January 29th, 1754, in the month of Shavat." Right? Shavat is always sometime in the winter months. And which you requested that the kahal, the congregation, should aid you to establish and form a synagogue in this place. So they had reached out to this congregation for help, so that we may keep the Torah scrolls and have the prayers. And they were, they were praised. May God accept your such a faithful and religious desire. So how did they respond to this request for funds? Well, you know what it's like to be a fundraiser. It's not so easy. And they responded, "We on our part praise you very much. And after we had read your letter in the full board," they had a full board meeting, 1754, "we resolved also to place it before a meeting of the elders." So not only was the board involved, but the elders, maybe the executive board, was also involved. "Considering all your circumstances, it was resolved that at the present time, it would not be convenient for us, nor are we able to comply with your request." So they were not, they were not granted their request. They did receive a blessing. "May God be the one who assists all, and of whose grace we would desire that he give to you as he is able, and may he prosper you in your pious plans. So those of you online that are fundraisers, perhaps this is the first fundraising correspondence on these shores among Jewish people. It's very possible. This might be one of the very, very, very first documents related to fundraising, but we see today that it's nothing new. And rejection is a part of fundraising. Was there a happy ending to the story, perhaps? So let's take a look and see. Apparently there was somewhat of a happy ending, because if you look at another historical website, they did get something from the Bevis Synagogue. They received a beautiful clock from them. And not only that, but they also received some charity boxes. So it wasn't a complete loss. And we read from Rabbi Theodore Lewis, who was a rabbi here for many years, for about 35, 40 years, how he was able to make that happen. Okay, I hope everyone's seeing the screen okay. Let's go back to another letter. Okay, so they tried again at a later date in 1764. They tried again to see if they could maintain some funds from a different organization. This time they went to the congregation in Curacao. So you see already how they're searching for other Jewish communities around the world. There was no internet, of course, no postage stamps. There was just some kind of communication, perhaps over months of time. So here they tried to get a response from the Mikveh Israel congregation. And they had a Christian individual who was helping them. Cheered by the hope of Mr. Frederick Dewitt, we, the officers of the above gentlemen, are hoping that you will be able to assist our worthy congregation so that we may be able to repay the obligation and mortgage which we were forced to place on our building, and so that we might be able to pay the workmen who constructed it. So you see, they were struggling to pay their mortgage at that time. This was a very, very small group, as I mentioned, and they were in trouble at this time and sought the help of the Curacao congregation. And a Christian individual, Mr. Dewitt from Curacao, who was probably connected to the Jewish community of Newport through business, and he was willing to help. They write, Mr. Dewitt has personal knowledge of our plight, has graciously encouraged us, offering us supervise and sponsor a campaign for funds to save the synagogue. Being an effective speaker, he proposes to open the drive for his campaign. And then we flatter ourselves that we practice the mitzvot. It is ingrained in your spirit. You will agree to come to the aid of this effort. May God lead you to such action, and may he be pleased to help our congregation with long life, help your congregation with long life, increase favor and prosperity for many years. And again, you see the same names of the people that were buried in the cemetery, the same individuals. These are the leaders of the Jewish community at that time. Aaron Lopez, who you might know was one of the wealthiest people in Newport. Moses Seixas, who wrote the famous letter to George Washington. And Isaac Touro, who was the first rabbi. Okay, so this is all taking place. Eventually, the synagogue was again. This is a picture of an interesting article that was in the Jewish News about Christians helping Jews fundraise. And again, that's nothing new. That's taking place today too. There are many Christians raising money for Jewish organizations in all over the world and in Israel. But I believe this might have been the first time that it took place in the 1700s. And Mr. Dewitt Frederick Dewitt, as you can see, is a little small, but he was a member of Curaçao's most distinguished Christian families, who probably had business relations with Newport Jewish merchants. He transmitted the appeal for synagogue funds to the Curacao congregation. And with characteristic Dutch drive and efficiency, he lent himself to help start the campaign and to organize his own little United Jewish appeal. All this in the 1700s. Quite interesting I'm going to skip the next slide because I'm running. Well, let's click on that. Hopefully we'll get a chance to see here what happened. They were successful in building the synagogue in the 1750s. As you know, 1763, Ezra Stiles was there. He was the person who helped describe it in his diaries. And he writes about the 300-year-old Torah, the 200-year-old Torah that they had from a gift from Amsterdam. So they were quite successful in building the synagogue with Ezra Stiles' help. And they were able to make it happen. I want to jump to another slide here. Of course, I'm going to go a little quicker the next few moments. What happened was eventually was the synagogue was built. They were successful, and you know, there were very fascinating things that took place in Newport in the 1700s, including George Washington's visit with a famous letter, the famous George Washington letter. That was today's still very, very important. And there were some quiet years, and that's where we're going to segue into our next speakers, of course. But I think that the reason why, you know, obviously why I was chosen to go first was because of the amazing history that started in the 1600s and a precedent-setting history for American Jewish history. Because a lot of what took place then is still taking place now. And to think about the fact that all this was going on, the fundraising, the building, the details of the mortgage, and of course, the struggles that a small community has, as small communities in New England might have. Christian and Jewish communities in New England have always had challenges, many of them being smaller communities in some of the locations that didn't have great growth like they did in some other cities. And how do you keep your church going? How do you keep your synagogue going? How do you raise funds? All challenges that churches and synagogues face today, and that synagogues all over the world face today, were being faced by the people here in the 1600s. So I am honored to lead us off. And now I look forward to hearing about how this all developed into the next centuries and years. And thank you so much for listening and for your participation.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Mandel. Next, we're going to hear from Maddie Beale, who is at Strawbery Banke Museum, about the Shapiro family, whose history is preserved in the house on their property. So Maddie, if you could share your screen.
Gotta figure out how to unmute myself. So if you have not been to Strawbery Banke Museum before, we are located in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and we preserve over 300 years of history in a single neighborhood. So the Shapiros are just one of about roughly 40 buildings on our site that are historic houses in which we tell the stories of the people who lived here. So I will quickly just give you a little introduction to the time period that we typically discuss when we talk about the Shapiros. And a lot of what we know from the Shapiro family or about the Shapiro family and the neighborhood and Portsmouth at the time, which is the early 1900s to about the 1930s, come from oral histories that were taken from children who grew up in the neighborhood in the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s. So periodically I'll be sharing quotes from the oral histories. So this is one of my favorites. It wasn't an easy life, it wasn't a romantic life, and it wasn't a very social life. People were just trying to scratch out a living. That's what they were trying to do. And so it's worth noting that in the early 20th century in Portsmouth, there had been about 200 years of Jewish life in Portsmouth already. There were families who had been here, you know, for generations, but as probably we'll hear from Lynne, there, you know, was this huge wave of immigration at the tail of the 19th and early 20th century. And the Shapiros at Strawbery Banke were dead center. They came right in the thick of that. So we focus mostly on the story of Abraham and Sarah Shapiro, who came to Portsmouth in 1905, roughly. They came about the same time. They actually already knew each other in the old country. They were brother and sister-in-law. And when they were in Portsmouth, it's sort of supposed that their marriage was arranged by their brother and their sister who were already married. It was a good match. And so they settled pretty quickly into a life in Portsmouth and bought their house that we still interpret today in 1909. So the Shapiros came from one region of Ukraine, but two different shtetl. So they were, I think, supposed to have been tailors and shoemakers. There is a little bit of a discrepancy in oral histories about that, but multiple members of the Shapiro family on both sides came to America essentially between 1898 and about 1915. So quickly we will go over. So Mrs. Shapiro, Sarah Shapiro, or Sheva as she was called in the family, came from Haradnitsa, which was the slightly larger of the two villages. Her parents are pictured here. We don't know very much about their lives in the shtetl, but we do know a lot about sort of the surrounding cultural events that were preserved in the historic record. So there were some fairly large outbreaks of typhus, fires, which I think were common in a lot of shtetl. But the thing that really spurred the Shapiro family members to come to America were conscription into the Russian army, which Sheva Shapiro's brother almost did not survive. He was conscripted at a very young age and was injured. And so, you know, that really spurred the movement. And so then, of course, Mr. Shapiro, Avram, came to America from Anapole, and there are a few Anapoles. So this one also had a larger outbreak of typhus. There were actually a number of pogroms that took place around the time that Avram and his family would have been living there. And so again, really there were quite a few things that spurred them into action. So by 1907, there were 17 family members living in Portsmouth, but there were also many, many family members living all across New England, a lot of them centering around Lowell. There were some in Amesbury and some in Maine, Nashua, New Hampshire, Manchester. So they did sort of spread out, and then eventually a lot of them trickled back into Portsmouth. But one of the things that really does sort of confirm for us at Strawbery Banke in our research the stories of the family being cobblers or shoemakers and tailors is that almost to a person, they went into the shoe industry, which was very large in Portsmouth and southern New Hampshire at the time. And so you see, just waves of Shapiros and Tappers. Tapper was Sheva's maiden name, coming and almost immediately setting up shop, quite literally setting up shop in Portsmouth and Lowell and all around northern Massachusetts and southern New Hampshire. So the story of the first Shapiro family member to come to America is that Avram's older brother, Shepsel, and I should also note that the Shapiros did change their name upon arrival because they felt that mill handler was a less common name, and Shapiro was actually quite a common name for other Jewish families in Portsmouth at the time. So they changed it to Shapiro to sort of, I guess, assimilate a little bit more smoothly. But Shepsel mill handler came. It is supposed that he had his tickets stolen from him on a sort of layover in London. And so he chased after the man who stole his ticket after staying with another Jewish family in London for a period to work off the pay for a ticket to America. And when he arrived, he found the guy. The guy had been working in Portsmouth, but had, beat it out of town. And Shepsel eventually came back with his wife and daughters. So we don't have very clear records about all of the arrivals of all the Shapiro family members. They really did sort of come in through all ports. A number of them came through Boston. Some of them came through Ellis Island, and those are sort of the easiest ones to trace. Many of them came through Quebec and other ports in Canada, and then took trains down. And being that there were so many of them who came in such a short period of time, it does get a little confusing, as their names are sometimes recorded wrong or misspelled, and so it can be a little bit of a process to research. But here we have Elia Tapper, who was one of the brothers of Sheva, and they actually recorded Avram Shapiro as Avram Tapper, but we know that he was headed to the Shapiros' home in Portsmouth to stay until he got on his feet in America, as we have Portsmouth, New Hampshire right here. So one of the main reasons that Portsmouth saw sort of a boom of a Jewish community at the turn of the century was that it already had a very well-established immigrant population. As I mentioned before, there were Jewish families living and working and worshiping in Portsmouth before the arrival of the Shapiros. And what we find in the early 20th century is that a lot of them were very, a lot of immigrants were very concentrated into certain neighborhoods. So the Puddle Dock neighborhood, which is the neighborhood that Strawbery Banke preserves today, had become the Jewish section of Portsmouth. Previous to that, it had been, through all sorts of different phases. But we really see for sort of the duration of the early years of, or early decades of the 20th century, it was a mainly, predominantly Jewish neighborhood. Portsmouth also had access to the Kittery Naval Shipyard, well, the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Kittery, Maine, across the river. Lots of factories, lots of opportunity for new businesses to be established. You know, it was a fairly small northern New England city. And it was only about an hour away by train from either Boston or Portland. So it's really a central location. So here is a little bit about the Puddle Dock neighborhood. We have, fortunately at Strawbery Banke, a wonderful archaeology program. And so we know a lot about the families, both from the oral histories, but also from the archaeology that we've been able to confirm many of the oral histories over time. You know, it's tough when you're relying on oral histories for very, you know, small details about someone's life, because typically when you're taking an oral history, the person is in their 90s, and memory changes over time. Studies have shown that different people who have witnessed the same event can remember different things too. And so archaeology helps us to get real physical evidence. And one of the things that we are very fortunate and privileged to have on our site is a mikveh, which archaeologically there are not many in America, in the United States. So in 2014, our archaeology team excavated a mikveh, which was used very, very briefly by the members of the Jewish community in the Puddle Dock neighborhood and more widely in Portsmouth. And at that time, in the early 1910s, there were about 40 Jewish families in the neighborhood, 596 residents on the 1920 census. And so we see, or the 1910 census, so we see, you know, really high density in a 10-acre site. It's a very small site. And though you will go today and you'll see sort of large open spaces in the middle of the city, it is important to remember that this was an area that had tenements. It had a population density that in reports from the 20th century was compared to the North End of Boston, loosely compared to the Lower East Side of New York, but had similar features. So children attended public schools. Because it was such a conglomeration of people, of Jewish people from all over Europe, there were varied levels of religious observance. And so we see that, there's a overview. This is from a 1920 map that actually shows you all the houses that many of them are no longer standing at Strawbery Banke. And in fact, all of this right here is completely open. There are no longer any houses in this middle section. So you see the density when you take a look. So 46 Jefferson Street is the house that the Shapiro family ended up purchasing. Many families never actually owned a home in the Puddle Dock neighborhood. They rented for years and they would sort of hop from place to place. And then some of them would move away to Portland or Boston or even a more rural setting and purchase a house there. But the Shapiros, we know that early on in their lives in Portsmouth, they purchased this house. At the time that they purchased it, we are fairly certain, both from archaeologic excavations and from work that's been done on the house to rehabilitate the house and then later to restore the house, that during the Shapiro residence is when electricity was put into the home. We also have evidence that the Shapiros had a fire. This is their kitchen. A fire in the mid to early 1910s, which destroyed part of their kitchen, and then they rebuilt a larger kitchen and included a bathroom, which was actually the first known indoor restroom in the neighborhood of nearly 600 people. So you can imagine the conditions of most families who would have been sharing privies in the backyard for easily another decade. And here are some of the artifacts found during the Shapiro excavation. All right, so an important part of the Shapiro story is that they were also crucial in founding the first permanent synagogue in the state of New Hampshire. It was originally built as a Methodist church in the 1820s, and in 1911, the Methodists had a new building, they were ready to move out, and the Congregation of Temple of Israel, which has since been shortened to Temple Israel, really was looking for a new home and had been searching for years. And Abraham Shapiro, Avram, actually was part of the committee that helped to purchase the Methodist church building. And very, very soon after the congregation moved into Temple of Israel, there was an explosion, I think you could say, of Jewish culture in Portsmouth. Not that it hadn't been there previously, but you start to see really evident in the Portsmouth newspapers and society pages that this was a really vibrant, very active community and a community center. So a number of Zionist organizations were founded early on in Temple Israel's history. And the Shapiro's daughter, Molly, was very involved as well in Hebrew school, in lots and lots of clubs and plays and music lessons. One thing that is always really important to state is that at the time that the Shapiros were living in Portsmouth, there was a huge resurgence in almost every New England state and more generally across the country of white supremacist movements. And so the KKK had an incredibly high enrollment. There were actually demonstrations on Jefferson Street, the street that the Shapiros lived on during the 1920s and 1930s. And this is actually an advertisement for membership in the newspaper, which is pretty incredible. Most families who grew up in the neighborhood loved living there, despite really living in what we would probably consider today an impoverished area. Here are just some quotes, and I don't have time to read them all, but they're wonderful. So here is the restored house today. Oops. And so we have restored both the outside and the inside to reflect 1919, which was the year that Avram Shapiro was president of the Temple Israel congregation. And right after the Shapiros moved out, the Levi family moved in, so it remained a Jewish household for a number of years. The Shapiros had one daughter, Molly Mary Shapiro, who was the first person in the family to attend college, but she very tragically died of postpartum complications. She was very young and really had just married. She had a little boy named Bert, And Bert actually grew up with the Shapiros, not with them in that house, but he returned to Portsmouth after the death of his mother so that his father could sort of recuperate. He lived in their second home on Middle Street in Portsmouth, just a few blocks away. And Bert is actually still very active in the Portsmouth community today. Here are some of the other descendants of the Shapiro family at our 20th anniversary celebration of the opening of the house. So we're incredibly privileged to have, so many resources, the stakeholders, the family members. Temple Israel is still just a block away from us. And we're just really fortunate to have a story like the Shapiros to tell of a family who came to America, really became very successful and made life meaningful.
Thank you so much. Sorry about the lighting here. I've got some bad lighting from the sunset, but I want to now turn it over to Lynne Krasker Schultz at the Vilna Shul here in Boston, and she's going to tell you not only about the Vilna Shul, but about immigration and the current Jewish community life. So Lynne, on to you.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you to the previous speakers. Some of what I will say, you will hear themes that the other speakers, Rabbi Mandel and Maddie, spoke about, which is really interesting and fascinating. Even though we're talking about different centuries and decades, the themes are still similar. The Vilna Shul, and I'll share some pictures with you in just a few minutes, but the Vilna Shul is a Jewish community center that focuses on arts, cultures, and ideas today. We were built back in 1919. This physical building was built back in 1919. So we're just celebrating over our 100-year anniversary. We were planning on having a big, giant celebration last year. And of course, the pandemic impacted that greatly. But the congregation actually predates this specific building. The congregation started to form in the late 1880s. As Maddie said, there was a big wave of immigration starting in the 1860s and 1870s from Eastern Europe into the United States. You saw a lot of new records, especially Eastern European Jewish families coming through Ellis Island. Those that decided to travel to Boston wound up in, most likely, Boston's West End. And today we don't think of Boston truly as having a West End like the Back Bay or the South End or Southie. The West End today is really mostly Mass General Hospital. But back then it was not. The West End went from the top of Beacon Hill, if you're familiar with Boston, out towards the Charles River, and then down towards the North End, basically where South Station was, and wrapped around to where Government Center is today. So it's technically 4 square miles, not that big. Not that big at all, but it was very, very highly populated. It was not overly Jewish or overly Irish or overly African American. It was overly immigrant. And that's really the resounding theme throughout the West End. If you look at the Manhattan during the same time period, you see very similar tenement houses. But what defined the West End, not only was it being an immigrant population, but everyone was very kind, everyone was very neighborhoodly, everyone knew everyone else's business. There wasn't a lot of privacy. We have stories of people who said that they grew up in the West End in the 1910s, 1930s, 1940s. And as kids, they would be outside playing baseball. And before they would break a window with their baseball, typical kid behavior. Nothing too abnormal. And before they could get home and decide whether they were going to lie to their parents about whether they broke their window, their parents already knew. That's how quickly word spread. If someone passed away, neighbors were there to pick up for childcare. They were there to help provide food. If someone lost a job, they were there to help with hand-me-downs for clothing. And so the neighborhood was very, very cordial, very friendly, very homely, but it was also very poor. It was an immigrant community. The Jews in this area typically settled not only because they could afford it, but because there was easy access to jobs. There were jobs at the river that they could do, unloading and loading boats. They also could walk to the other side of Beacon Hill, which was the more wealthy side of Beacon Hill. Louisburg Square is there still today, which is where Teresa Hines and John Kerry live. The State House is there today, and they would do things like clean out the horse stalls or serve as housekeepers or child caregivers or those types of jobs. And so the Jewish population was really starting to grow as more and more immigrants decided to come into Boston and settle here. And so in 1902, there were over 50 Jewish places of worship in Boston proper. And why that's significant is because today the Vilna Shul is the only building that still stands from that era, which is just absolutely amazing. And we're very careful to say over 50 Jewish places of worship because all of them weren't big giant buildings. They weren't established organizations. Some of them were minyans, which is prayer groups meeting in people's homes. And that's actually how the Vilna congregation began. It began as a group of men meeting in people's homes in the late 1880s, the early 1890s. And it suddenly grew and grew. And what defined all of these different, as I said, there were over 50 places of worship was where people were from. Even if you lived right next door to the Vilna Shul, which was built by Jews from Vilnius, Lithuania, hence the name Vilna Shul. If you were from, if you were from Warsaw or you were from somewhere else, you didn't come to the Vilna, even if it was closest in proximity. You went to where your population was and where your people were, which is really fascinating because they could all speak to one another. They all spoke Yiddish. And so there wasn't a language barrier, but there was a custom barrier. They were used to being with people who were from their shtetls or from their villages or had common customs, sing similar tunes. And that's really interesting. And so of these 50 places, the Vilna congregation attracted people from Vilnius, Lithuania. By 1906, they had grown large enough and they had raised enough money that they were able to purchase a building just down the street. And the building they purchased, it's no longer there. If you come to Boston and you come on a tour of the Vilna, we tell you not to go and look for it because it's just buildings right now. But it was at 45 Phillip Street and it was the former 12th Baptist Church. The 12th Baptist Church was very well known for having the only, many of the members served in the 54th Regiment, which was the only African-American regiment to fight in the Civil War. And so the 12th Baptist was somewhat well known, but the Jewish congregants prayed there for about 10 years. And when I show you some pictures in a few minutes, it's really interesting because a lot of the furniture that we still have in the building today was from and built for the 12th Baptist Church. And so it's just interesting that over 100 years later, it still stays valid and useful. And, these congregants were very, very resourceful by reusing some of this furniture. And so in 1916, the city of Boston decided to take that land by public domain and they kicked the congregation out. And there's some really good jokes that I won't tell right now about wandering Jews, but they wandered around for a few years. And then in 1918, they purchased 3 parcels of land, 14, 16, and 18 Phillip Street. And today our address is 18 Phillip Street, and they literally built this building from the ground up. So if you give me one moment, I'm going to share my screen and show you a few pictures. Let's see if I can do this. So this is the current Vilna building, and you can see how it was kind of, we're switching things, but how it's wedged between different things. And this is, if you can see right here, this is the Vilna building, and this picture was taken in the early, 1920s. But it's really interesting to see how the different landscapes. The building's set just back from the street, which is really, really interesting. And as I was talking about the West End earlier, this is actually what's now Center Plaza. It's the famous Joe and Nemo's at Stoddard and Howard Streets. And so it was a really famous restaurant that people used to go to. But you can see kind of the neighborhood and how it's not the classiest neighborhood. It's a little bit, on the lower side, and it's really interesting. This is the Vilna back when they reopened after they built in 1919, educating a group of students. And so I mentioned a little bit earlier about how a lot of the furniture that we have in the current building dates back to the 12th Baptist Church from 1906 to 1916. And one of those artifacts is the ark itself. And you can see how beautiful the ark is. And at the top, what's very, very interesting is this American eagle. Usually, as most people who are religious Jews know, the top thing on an ark is the eternal light. And you can see that right here. The eternal light symbolizes God is omnipresent, God is always with us. And so it's really this juxtaposition between their Jewish identity and their American identity. And when we talk about the Pew study and the trends in Jewish population today, it's interesting to see that, 100 years later, Jews are still struggling with this. Am I an American? Am I a Jew? Am I a Jewish American? Am I American Jew, right? It's the same thing. And so it's very fascinating that they chose, the congregants, to put this American eagle at the top of their most religious symbol in the sanctuary and not the traditional Jewish symbol, which is the eternal light. You can see the 10 Commandments and the Lions of Judah on here. You can also see, hopefully a little bit, you can see it better here. And then right here is a really good picture. The hands. And this is the sign of the Kohanes, the priestly tribe. If some of you ever watch Star Trek, you'll notice that that symbol looks very similar to Spock. Leonard Nimoy, who played Spock, actually grew up in the West End, right down from the Vilna Shul. He was not a congregant here, but when he was on the set of Star Trek in the early days, they said to him, think of something that's going to help identify your character. And of course, he reaches into his Orthodox Jewish upbringing and comes up with the sign of the Kohanes. Now, of course, he wasn't going to use a religious symbol on national TV, so he just took one of his hands. But it's really interesting to think that this, symbol of Spock became very, very well known, and most people don't realize that it has religious Jewish roots in it. I mentioned the furniture, and this is one of the benches that dates back to the 12th Baptist Church. The 12th Baptist congregation actually built these benches in 1848 for their own congregation. And you can't see it very well in this picture, but there used to be a cross right around here. And the Jewish congregations, when they inherited the benches, they simply carved off the two angles of the cross, and now there's just a strip down the middle here, which is really fabulous. They weren't going to spend the money to create new benches. They were just going to use what they have, and it's really, really interesting. This is a picture of the sanctuary pre-renovation. We just finished a renovation project, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. And so in the congregation was lively. It was vibrant through the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, and even the early 1950s. It had plenty of life cycle events, from bris and brits, which are baby namings, to bar mitzvahs, to Shabbat services, to daily minyans. It was an Orthodox congregation, but there was lots of life and activity and learning happening in this space. I'm currently sitting in the community room, and you can see that there's an ark behind me as well. This room was used for daily minyan as well as regular learning and engagement opportunities, which was nice. And then the late 1950s rolls around. And what happened is the city of Boston won some federal money to clean up neighborhoods. And so they embarked on a redevelopment project. What that ended up doing, and I'll show some pictures in a moment, is it ended up basically knocking down all of the tenement houses except for one single house or one single tenement in the West End. And so over 8,000 immigrants were displaced, literally no place to go. And so they had to move elsewhere. There was no housing left in this area. And so the population of the Vilna, all of these people who were coming, who were walking because they didn't own cars or they wouldn't take public transportation, they were walking to their synagogue, suddenly were not in walking distance. And so new synagogues started to pop up in areas that they started to move, but therefore the population of the Vilna suddenly went from vibrant to literally no one. And so this is one of the pictures you can see of the Boston Redevelopment Authority. Let's see. And this is, after they knocked down some of the tenement houses. It's just absolutely devastating and insane. And so the congregation struggled very, very much through the 60s, 70s, and finally in the mid-80s, they closed their doors. By that time, the Vilna was in disrepair. You can see the wall that's peeling a little bit and crumbling, and the building literally sat empty for years. At one point, it was condemned, and it was going to be turned into a parking garage. A group of philanthropists and Boston Jews got together and said, you can't turn it into a parking garage. Even though Beacon Hill desperately needs parking, you can't turn it into a parking garage. You have to save it. It's the last building. It's the last synagogue that exists from this immigrant era. It would be a shame to get rid of it. And so they tried to raise some funds to purchase it. They weren't able to purchase it. It's really fascinating. And so it was ready to go to the auction block and to be sold off. And then in the early 90s, the stock market crashed. Many of you probably remember that. And an early mini recession began. And when that stock market crash happened, the real estate market also crashed. And so they suddenly were able to afford the building, which was miraculous and amazing. And so they purchased the building and they came in. And when they came in, this wall, this entire ceiling had separated from the wall, and the rain and the snow and the birds and the raccoons, and everything was in here. It was just an absolute mess. There was furniture everywhere. There was water damage. Today, we don't have a lot of records because they were all damaged when the building was condemned. Amazingly enough, the ark that I showed you earlier was still there, a little bit dusty, no water damage, but in near perfect condition. The 6 Taurus Scrolls, which were just left in the building in the mid-1980s, were okay. One of them was slightly damaged, but the other 5 are still in use today. It's just absolutely amazing that they left and they walked out with this. And so the Vilna opened, and we decided, is it going to be a living museum? Is it going to be a cultural center? Is it going to be a synagogue? And the board was grappling with all of this. And while they were coming to terms with their ideas for vision and mission, we discovered that there were different layers of murals on the synagogue walls upstairs in the sanctuary. And here you can see some of the curators and archivists restoring the murals. What they discovered is that there are 3 layers of art murals painted on top of one another. All were painted sometime between 1920 and 1933. And, times changed, leadership changed. They decided they wanted a new look. I'll point out the 3 artscapes in just a moment. But someone on a tour once joked with me, a congregant probably owned a paint store and needed to unload the paint. So they gave it and they painted the walls again. It's absolutely fascinating, right? And the ceilings of the Vilna are extremely, extremely tall. And so when you think about it, it's just amazing that someone was standing up here on the ceiling on a ladder painting this. This is the original artscape back from 1919, and it's the only one that's on the ceiling. The second artscape is this kind of art deco that you see a little bit over here and a little bit over here. And then the third one is this blue flowery scrolls that's above the windows. And then finally, they layered on a beige paint layer on top, and then on the ceiling, a green paint layer, which some say, it's a shame that they covered it up. In actuality, it's amazing and it's a blessing that they did, because this last layer of paint helps seal it from light and seal it from oxygen, thereby preserving the 3 layers of paint where the weather didn't damage it. And so it's just amazing because we are able to uncover and learn about these different murals. And so I mentioned earlier that we recently did a renovation project, and this is one of the construction machines outside our building. So in 2006, the Vilna decided to restore one of the walls for the murals. And since then, it's been our goal to really make the building accessible. Prior to the renovation, if you were in a wheelchair or a walker or had mobility issues, you just weren't getting into the Vilna. There were steps to get into onto the front plaza and steps to get into the front door, and it just wasn't possible. And so through a lot of hard work and mission clarity and vision, the organization was able to raise enough money to make us sustainable, in that we are now accessible for anyone and everyone who wants to come in. We upgraded a lot of the facilities. We had knob and tube wiring from 1919. The Vilna was one of the first institutions on Beacon Hill to have electricity, and the congregants were really, really proud of that. They should have been proud of that. But in 2020, you don't want knob and tube wiring. It's a fire hazard, right? And so we were able to upgrade the electric. We were able to put in a real HVAC system. So in the summer, we can have working air conditioning, and in the winter, we can have working heat. Always a big deal when you're trying to welcome people into the building. And so today, as I mentioned when I started, we exist as the Center for Arts, Culture, and Ideas, as well as this living museum. We tell the history of the Boston Jews. We have a permanent exhibition within our community room. And we really focus on building community and bringing people together using Jewish arts, culture, and ideas as a platform. We were very anxious, as Rabbi Mandel spoke about, to talk about the current Jewish community. And for anyone who works in the Jewish communal world, they know that the Pew Institute recently did a study on American Jewry. And the results were a little bit surprising and really wonderful and reassuring, in that the Jewish population in the United States is growing at the same rate as the regular population. And so there's no misstep in that. But what was interesting that came out of it is there's this new category called Jews of no religion, because Jews are not just religious, they're cultural, they're food, they're film, there's language. There's so much more that goes into being Jewish and Judaism than just spirituality and religion. And so there's this new category that is growing exponentially, called Jews of no religion. And these are the people, specifically young adults, who are really interested in the cultural aspects, engaging their history, their culture, their traditions through different modalities like film, art, history, food, all of those different types of things. And so it's really reassuring and interesting. And we hope to be that urban destination for people, to be the Jewish home that they're seeking when they leave home. This is the mural that I spoke about that's completely restored. It's at the back of the women's gallery. And you can see these beautiful chandeliers. There's another picture of the chandelier right here. And you can see this Jewish star on it. When I talk about us being a living museum, really our building is our artifact. The chandeliers were purchased off of a hotel going out of business around the corner. And while we're not certain, we can pretty much assume with certainty that the chandeliers were not inherited or purchased with the Jewish star affixed to them. But again, it's this idea that they were really proud to have electricity. They were one of the first on Beacon Hill to have it. And you can see the light bulbs on the corner of the star. It's just a riot, and so unique and interesting that someone thought of this. But this idea of we're proud to be American, we're proud to have electricity, and we're proud to be Jewish, and marrying these two concepts together. This is the new community room. The Ark is right behind this pole. And we will be hosting different art exhibitions throughout the year that focus on different aspects of Jewish art, culture, and ideas. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I think that we'll turn it back to Claire for questions and answers.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating look at a gorgeous building, and I really encourage everyone who has the chance to visit Boston to visit the Vilna Shul. I myself saw it before renovation, and I'm really excited to finally be able to see it after renovation. So we have a number of questions, and I think anyone on the panel can chime in if you have a good answer to some of these. So we have a question about other early Jewish communities in New England, specifically, outside of Newport in the 17th and 18th century. Were there other Jewish communities?
Well, I can just add a few things. I can add a few things, and then my colleagues feel free to, offer any ideas. We do know that Touro Synagogue is the oldest building, oldest Jewish synagogue in the United States today, because it's the only one that's still in the colonial style. But there were, of course, Jewish communities in New York and Sheretz Israel, which preceded Touro, and that's the Peter Stuyvesant story. And there were other Jewish communities that Touro communicated with in Philadelphia, in Savannah, and in Virginia. So there definitely were other communities, but many of these were Sephardic, as the first settlers were primarily Sephardic Jews.
Cincinnati was also a large hub. It's, known as the hub of, or the center of Reform Judaism back in, the early 1800s. And so that's another community. Again, it doesn't predate Touro, but it, predates the Boston and the New Hampshire Jewish immigration stories.
So we have a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No. Please add something. Yeah.
Oh, well, I was going to say that Portsmouth has always recorded that their first Jewish residents were from 1780, Abraham Isaacs and his wife from Prussia. But it is possible that there were folks who went unrecorded before that, just, slipped under the radar. So,
right. So here's another question for you, Maddie. Someone wants to know about the Jewish population in Portsmouth now. They live in downtown Portsmouth and had never heard about the mikvah or the Jewish history program. So are there organized tours or programs that highlight the Jewish culture of Portsmouth? And is there still a large Jewish presence in Portsmouth?
Well, I know that the Israel, I would say, is really the center of the Jewish community in Portsmouth today. And they have about 300 families collectively from Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, who attend. They have a wonderful program of tours that we have taken advantage of ourselves at Strawbery Banke. But I think for a number of years, as Strawbery Banke is concerned, we really focused very specifically on the house that the Shapiros lived in. And so we are expanding in being able to include yes. So we are expanding to be able to include more about the Jewish history of Portsmouth, but the mikveh is no longer visible. We did have to cover that just for purposes of preservation. And yeah, so I guess that would be my answer. And I know that if you look more on the Temple Israel site, they can tell you much, much more than I can at this moment.
I'll jump in and say that the Jewish population of New Hampshire as a whole, especially southern New Hampshire, is starting to grow exponentially as people are trying to move to Boston, getting priced out because of the real estate market here. They're going north, right? And Boston, according to the 2015 study out of Brandeis, is the fourth largest Jewish population in the country, with about just under 250,000 Jews. So as the urban Jews, are growing, starting to have families, starting to move to the suburbs, natural evolution of life cycle, they're starting to move up to the New Hampshire, southern New Hampshire area. I can't speak as much to the northern New Hampshire area, but you'll see, I would suspect in the next 10 years, that population to grow. So
let's see. Lynn, we have some questions that relate to Boston. So where did the West Enders move? Did they move to Lynn, Revere, Chelsea, or were they the populations that made up the Jewish communities in Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan, or was it a combination of?
Yes, and yes, absolutely. Okay. They moved wherever they could go, to be honest. And I want to be clear, it wasn't just the Jewish population that was displaced because of the West End demolition. It was the entire population of the West End. This wasn't specifically Jewish focused or anti-Semitic in any way. It was kind of anti-immigrant. If you haven't visited the West End Museum, which is right across from the station, I will give them a plug because they are an incredible resource and they tell the history of the West End and Boston proper. And the one single solitary remaining tenement house is literally across the street from the West End Museum, literally boxed in by big dig roads. And ironically enough, it has a giant Apple billboard on its side, right? Is that not irony for it? But the West End Museum is a great resource, but the population went wherever they could, really. Many of them didn't have cars, so they literally were packing up their belongings on their back and, taking the public transportation or, moving wherever they could and they could afford. Many moved in with families or friends. And so, if you had a niece or a nephew or a grandparent that was living in Chelsea or Lynn or Mattapan, you were moving out with them to be with them. So wherever they could go.
So I have a question, or there's a question that maybe any or all of you could answer. What can you tell us about the Jewish community in Maine? It was talked about a little bit in relation to, the connections with Portsmouth, but does anyone have any more that can talk about the history of the Jewish community in the state of Maine?
Please go ahead, Lynn. Please, you first.
I was just going to say, I don't know a lot about it, but there's a great museum called the Museum of Southern Maine, I believe. That is wonderful. And it's a Jewish museum focused. Who would have known, right? But there's a Jewish museum in Southern Maine.
Right. So I was just going to add a couple of things to that. First of all, I had the honor of being a rabbi in Portland, Maine for several years. It's a very, very nice New England town. It's similar a little bit to Newport, those of you that have been here. But there is a rich history of Jewish people going up to Maine and living there. I know in Portland and Bangor had a nice Jewish community, and it's pretty much the way we've heard it tonight. The people in the mid 1800s and late 1800s, they started in New York and they just went straight up. And, they went straight up and, they tried whether it was shoe business or the peddler business or what, you name it, they tried it. And they were successful in many of these towns. And Bangor had a nice Jewish community in the 1800s, already blossoming. I think Portland, Maine was a little later. But yes, there's a rich history of Jews in Maine.
There also are some really great online resources. A lot of them are, really focused on Portland, but just about the Jewish life in Maine and the Jewish community in Maine throughout history. And I know that, we, from our oral histories, there was a lot of exchange between Jewish communities. And so you do see people kind of hopping back and forth and then going down to Boston and going out to Chelsea. And, so it wasn't like silos. It was a broader community in New England.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that, there's a whole history of people who used to go up and down fundraising for Jewish institutions. And, they would go everywhere that there were Jews. And I had heard from the rabbi in Bangor years ago that at one time, Bangor was one of the best places for fundraisers to go to. So, and that includes, up and down the whole East Coast.
So we have another kind of general question. Were there communities on Cape Cod? They're specifically talking about, it looks like vacation communities. Were there vacation areas open to Jews on Cape Cod, or was it restricted as, some places were, discriminatory toward Jewish people and lots of other people too? Does anyone know anything about that?
I am afraid that's one area that I do not know that well, although I do know that Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik from the Boston area, who was a well-known rabbi in Boston at one time, used to vacation with a whole bunch of his congregants in Onset. But I don't know, I'm not that familiar with the Cape. Sorry.
I don't know. I would think that just based on ancillary information that Provincetown had somewhat of a Jewish population, as, P-Town, because it was on the outskirts, attracted people that didn't fit in otherwise. But I can't speak with any knowledge to that. It's just a guess.
That makes sense. Let's see. So, Lynn, did the Jews in Boston have a Landsmannschaft, guess that translates to Burial Society, as they did in New York, and did they purchase community plots and cemeteries?
I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. I do know that there was a group, there was a Landsmannschaft, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I don't know much about it, so I don't want to speak on that behalf. And Rabbi Mandel, you may know more about the big Jewish community cemetery over in West Roxbury. That it's there's one road and there's 20 or 30 different cemeteries on that one road. I want to say it's Baker Street, but don't hold me to that. And some of them date back centuries. So, but again, I can't speak with any integrity because I don't know the history.
Yeah, I think it's a great question because it's such a common thing. If you go into some old cemeteries in the New York area, I mean, you just one after another, you see whole sections that were purchased by groups of immigrants. So my feeling is that it might not have been the numbers like they had in the New York area to put those things together. We have some very old Jewish cemeteries in Newport, but those are put together, organized by families, not really by groups. So it could just be a question of having the numbers, you know, the critical mass to put those groups together.
Let's see. There was a question. Does anyone know whether Jewish people were involved in the maritime industries, specifically shipbuilding or trade or anything like that?
Well, I can only tell you that the first settlers who came to Newport were all merchants. They were all traders. They were all business people. You know, the Jews were not in the professions in those eras. These were primarily people who came here, you know, with new goods, new merchandise, and the harbor is what brought them here. You know, the beautiful Newport Harbor, which you've probably seen, or probably many of you have seen. And they were heavily into the shipping goods. I don't know if they were building the ships, but they were certainly heavily into that industry of transporting goods all around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Abraham Isaacs in Portsmouth was a merchant, and very early on he placed many ads in the local papers for goods coming in, and so we have some pretty clear ties to the maritime industry there, because really what almost everyone did in Portsmouth.
Right.
Right. We know that Judah Touro, for example, many of the Jews left Newport after the Revolutionary War, and when Judah Touro went down to New Orleans and continued built his shipping empire there. So absolutely, this was a very big industry for them, and Judah Touro was one of the most prosperous people alive at that time.
And we know that they worked on ships in Boston as well, proximity to the harbor. There were a lot of jobs, and they were easy jobs to get that didn't require, being a shoemaker or being, some sort of, it required some skills. And so anyone could go and unload, the ships that were docking with goods type of thing.
All right, so I think we have time for maybe one more question. Let me see. I just want to mention, some people were asking if we can share this program. I will send out a recording, and that link will be, good for anyone who is able to access the link, and you send them a password and it should work. It'll also be eventually on our YouTube channel, so it will be available to the public. Let's see. There's a lot of questions just generally about were there Jewish communities in this place and that place and that place. So all three of you, is there any other things you want to mention, or communities you want to talk about that kind of were important to Jewish history that you weren't able to touch on in your regular presentation? Is there something that kind of like I had to leave out at the last minute that you want to mention before we wrap it up?
Oh, thank you, Claire, for organizing this program, and thank you to my fellow panelists for wonderful presentations. The only thing I would say about the community in Newport is that many of the people were very, very philanthropic, and were really set the tone for future American philanthropy. That's why the synagogue is called the Touro Synagogue. It's clear because the Touros just bless this city with so much. Jews, Christians, whoever was here received their blessings. And, they did the same thing in New Orleans with the Touro Hospital was dedicated in their names. And that's the point I would like to make, is that these people, when they came to here, had a feeling that they wanted to give back. We're very grateful for their newfound home, and wanted to give back, and gave back in a major way.
I would,
go ahead, Maddie.
Sorry, Lynn.
Nope, go ahead.
I would say that, along similar lines, the Temple Israel community and the broader Jewish community in Portsmouth had also an incredibly, philanthropic history in the city. One of the stories that we hear a lot from our oral histories is that the women of Sheva Shapiro's generation frequently went door to door, even to their non-Jewish neighbors, to make sure they were fed and cared for, and also, the Zionist organizations in Temple Israel at that time were huge fundraisers and proponents of ending, violence against Jews in Eastern Europe. And so we see a lot of that, and we see the Shapiros and so many other members of the Portsmouth community involved in raising funds for that. So it's really inspiring to see, traditions carried forward for so many years.
I'll just chime in and say this program has been wonderful, but it in no way, shape, or form replicates actually being in the spaces. The tour that you get at Strawbery Banke or at Touro Synagogue or at the Vilna, being able to touch the artifacts and feel the walls whispering to you, really cannot be replicated in any virtual platform. And so thank you all for joining us. But if you're in the area, please make it a point to come and visit our sites in person, because even though you've heard a little bit of what we're about, it's a completely different, eye-opening experience to be here in person, and you take in different things. I'll also say it's really important, I think, to just keep talking about things like our own immigrant histories, our shared experiences. Research is showing that many children don't know anything about the Holocaust, don't know anything about why anti-Semitism is rising and why we should stop it and why we should serve as upstanders in society. And those are really important things that we need to educate our youth about and continue to bring to the forefront of not only our minds, but our community's minds and the people we network with and surround ourselves with. So please come, keep thinking about this. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you in person.
Yeah. Well, can you tell us, when they might be able to come see you, each of you, when your buildings might be open?
So the Vilna is having a few small programs this summer, and then we'll be open regularly starting on the high holidays, which amazingly enough are remarkably early. They're Labor Day weekend this year for anyone who celebrates and has not looked at a calendar. So in the fall, we'll really be available on a more regular basis with a couple special opportunities this summer.
Okay, great.
Our synagogue took a wonderful trip to the Vilna Shul a few years ago. It was really fantastic. We loved it. It was great. And, it was, I think, like Lynn says, you really need to be in the space and look at the neighborhood around it and get a feel for everything around to appreciate and enjoy it. We are actually open now outdoors. We have outdoor tours. And I think we're heading into July with some some changes coming up in the next few days. So I'll probably have, hopefully have indoor tours soon. And
Great.
so we are having services now, but on a limited basis.
Great, great.
Strawbery Banke just opened for the season. So we have our historic house season until mid-October this year. And we are open every day, 7 days a week from 10 to 5. Our house is open this year. It was not open last year. So we're really glad about that.